es Becka.
Mi nombre es Pablo.
My name's Sam.
Thanks for watching us on DPS TV.
So in other videos, we've talked about the idea that a person's DNA or an organism's DNA helps to build that organism's body. And we talked a little bit about the idea that the reason that that happens is that DNA actually codes for specific proteins. Today we want to get into just the fundamentals of heredity, some of the basic ideas around heredity, and get a little bit more specific about how DNA actually does the work of building our bodies. So a lot of this work with genetics and heredity actually begins with a guy who many of us may have heard of. His name is Gregor Mendel. And Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. So he was someone who devoted his life to religion. He was living in a monastery in Austria, which is a country to the southeast of Germany. He was essentially a biologist, and he was a biologist not in the way that we think of a biologist today, somebody who had been to university for biology and who maybe works in a laboratory, but he was somebody who was still doing studies and was still actually investigating and researching, even though his occupation was technically just as a monk. And the studies that Mendel did were a lot of them were involved with pea plants that he grew in the monastery garden. And what he would do is he would mix one type of pea plant or one version of a pea plant that he found with another version of a pea plant. Say one pea plant might have purple flowers and one might have white flowers. And he would breed those two pea plants together and see what kind of resulting offspring those plants produced. And in doing that, he was able to determine some sort of important ideas around heredity that we still think about and use today. So if we could jump to my screen really quickly. One of the big ideas that comes up in heredity, one of the first concepts that we think about is a gene. So a gene is really a segment of DNA. It's a section of DNA that codes for a specific trait. So here on the screen, I've just got sort of a simple diagram that says genes, arrow traits, just to sort of describe the idea that genes lead to traits. Whatever our genes are, those determine our physical traits. So physical traits being things like our eye color, our hair color, our height, our skin color. In many cases, it's a lot of the physical appearance things. But it can also be traits like whether we carry certain markers for certain diseases, whether we're more susceptible to certain kinds of, say, addictions, or maybe whether we're susceptible to obesity or high blood pressure. So there's lots of different types of traits that can exist, and those traits are all coded by genes, and genes are all segments of DNA. And as we talked about before, segments of DNA code for specific proteins. So really, when we think about the physical traits of a person or an organism, those physical traits are determined by genes. And it's ultimately those genes and the production of proteins in the organism that determines how that organism is going to exist and live. So there are several different types of traits that can exist, expressed from different types of genes. So one type of a trait is a polygenic trait. And it's important to sort of start with thinking about polygenic traits because sometimes when we learn about heredity, it can be tempting to think that a single gene influences a single trait. Like, for example, my hair color is determined by a single gene. That's actually not true. My hair color is actually a polygenic trait. So what that means is polygenic means many genes. So what we're saying is there are actually multiple genes that affect my hair color. So that's polygenic. That's a polygenic trait here. If I can get my polygenic trait. Polygenic traits are going to be traits where multiple genes influence a single trait. Then we have pleiotropic traits. Pleiotropic traits, and the vocabulary can be kind of intense here, but pleiotropic traits can be thought of as essentially the inverse of a polygenic trait. A pleiotropic trait is going to be a trait where a single gene influences many different traits. So one particular gene might have an impact on skin color, hair color, and eye color. There's a gene called the OCA2 gene, OCA2 gene, that has to do with melanin production, and melanin is a protein that helps to determine the quantity of melanin that you have in your body makes your skin, your hair, or the iris of your eyes actually darker. And so one of the genes involved in that is the OCA2 gene, and so it's a gene that is pleiotropic because it is a single gene that affects multiple physical traits in a person. So again, that's a pleiotropic trait here. It's pleiotropic and polygenic. A lot of our traits, in fact, the vast majority of traits in our body are polygenic or pleiotropic. But for the purpose of thinking about heredity, sometimes it's really helpful to just think about something called a Mendelian trait. So a Mendelian trait, named after our friend Gregor Mendel, is a trait where just one gene influences one specific trait. And although there aren't that many Mendelian traits, true Mendelian traits, focusing on Mendelian traits and how they work, it can give us a good sense of heredity and sort of the fundamentals of heredity. So let's just jump to another picture here. So one of the other key concepts that we need to think about with heredity is that heredity is all based on the combination of two parents, a mother and a father. And so the mother and the father are both providing the same sets of DNA, right? So I've got a dad and a mom drawn here, and mom is going to provide a full set of DNA, and dad is also going to provide a full set of DNA for a living organism. And so what that means is, for any given living organism, and let's focus on humans specifically, for humans, we have a set of human DNA that comes from our mom and a set of human DNA that comes from our dad. And those segments of DNA are separated into what we call chromosomes. So you can see in this picture here, human cells contain 23 pairs of chromosomes. So you can see in this image there are 23 pairs. I'm not sure if you're actually able to see the numbers very clearly on the screen, but we have here pair number 1, pair number 2, pair number 3, and so on, and we go up to 23 different pairs. So there are 23 pairs because your mother provided 23 chromosomes and your father provided 23 chromosomes, and they were the same 23 chromosomes. 99.9% of the DNA in each of those chromosomes was exactly identical. But what's interesting is that in a living organism, in a baby human, it's the play between those two chromosomes, between the two chromosomes in pair 1 or the two chromosomes in pair 16, it's the play between them that really determines the traits that are expressed. And so the last thing that we'll kind of end with here in this fundamentals of heredity video is the idea that because there are two chromosomes, for every given gene, there are two versions of that gene that each person has. One version came from mom, and one version came from dad. And those versions of genes have a special name in genetics. We call those alleles. So an allele, as I just said, is just a version of a gene. So an allele is just a version of a gene, and you have two versions of every gene. Now, in some cases, you may have the same version of the gene. You may have gotten the same version from mom and from dad. You may have gotten different versions from mom and from dad, and it's the play between those two genes that are going to determine what your actual physical traits are. So in reality, the color of our eyes, whether we end up with blue eyes or brown eyes, that's actually a little bit more complex. It tends not to be a Mendelian trait. It's actually more of a polygenic trait. But in some ways, we can think of the blue eye and brown eye phenomenon as being similar to a Mendelian trait, because what we see is the play between having the brown eye allele and the blue eye allele informs us some about how heredity works. So I'll just end the video today by just saying that we have, in this example, two versions of a gene, a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene. But for any given gene, whether it's, say, the color of your skin, whether it's the wetness or dryness of earwax, which I know probably sounds like a strange thing, but in fact, the wetness and dryness of earwax is determined by a single gene that all of us carry in our 16th chromosome. But it's the play between the genes provided by mom and provided by dad that actually determine the physical traits that we all express. So in the next video that we do, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about how that play actually happens and how one gene can actually dominate another gene to be expressed. So we'll see that in the next video. Thanks for watching this episode of Tutor This. As always, if you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, leave them in the comments below. Remember to click the like button below, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, hit subscribe.